welcome to the questions and answers and networking session for the food and beverage panels which we've had for this week as part of Source for Tomorrow, powered by CommonShare. We are delighted to have some of the speakers from this week's panel. So the panels which we're going to be looking at are the investment opportunities in regenerative agriculture and also mass adoption in seafood. So we already have joining us today Toby Middleton. So he will be taking part as part of MSC. Toby, can you hear me?
Yep, loud and clear.
Hi, Toby, that's great. Would you mind just giving yourself a quick introduction?
Yeah, sure, thank you. So I am the head of market operations at the Marine Stewardship Council based in our head office in London. I've been with the MSC for just over 13 years, and I support our regional teams in developing our market strategy for how we reach out and engage with our commercial partners around the world.
Ryan, it's fantastic to have you here. Ryan from Monterey Bay Aquarium. Ryan, would you like to give yourself a quick introduction?
Absolutely. Also with a similar caveat that the internet and electricity here in California has been pretty rough because of the storms, a lot of landslides, a lot of down power lines. So apologies if you lose me. My name is Ryan Bigelow. I am the Senior Program Manager at the Seafood Watch program at the Monterey Bay Aquarium. I've been there for about 10 years, just over 10 years now, and I'm specifically focused on their campaigns to reach the general public and to promote the opportunities for businesses to reach broader segments of the population with their sustainable seafood efforts.
Thank you very much. We also have joining us right now Nisreen, who is the moderator of the panel in Investment Opportunities in Regenerative Agriculture. Nisreen, if you could just introduce yourself, that would be lovely.
Sure. Hi, everyone. My name is Nisreen. I'm a project manager for a small nonprofit called the Lexicon, which is based in California, but I'm over just outside of Boston. And yeah, what we're doing is we're working on a really multi-collaborative, multi-stakeholder project on expanding regenerative agriculture, first in Northern California, and then hopefully creating an adaptive model for the rest of the country and hopefully even the world.
Thank you so much. So we will be receiving some questions for our audience who are participating here. You can also write your questions in the questions and answer box, which we have as part of this meeting. Just to start off with, I do have a few questions from our Slack community. For Nisreen, what are the main issues to do with regenerative agriculture, and where are the opportunities to improve? And also, why are people not drawn immediately to regenerative agriculture?
Yeah, that's a great question. So there's a few layers to that one, I think.
Sure, apologies.
No problem. Yeah, starting with one of the last ones you said, maybe the non-immediacy to be drawn to regenerative is that there are so many variable definitions of regenerative agriculture. It doesn't have an official definition yet. And so there's a recent study from Colorado State University that describes how a lot of understanding regenerative is first starting with a definition. So I think some confusion about clarifying what it is to be regenerative is always a good place to start in terms of drawing more interest in regenerative agriculture. And some challenge, and that does bring its own host of challenges, but I think another challenge is that some regenerative approaches are a little bit more narrowly focused on carbon sequestration, which is incredibly important in terms of fostering soil health and building truly regenerative systems that generate ecosystem benefits, whether that's, first building soil health and then improving water filtration, biodiversity, and all the host of other co-benefits that come with that. Can be a challenge when different claims are being made for the potential for regenerative agriculture and the fear that that might take away from understanding it more holistically and understanding all of the potential benefits that could arise. Did I miss any other questions that came up?
No, that's...
The issues around adoption of a certification scheme is linked to fundamentally the market demand, which is primarily going to be influenced by consumer expectations. And so as sustainable consumption becomes more of a prominent issue within a market environment, that creates you know, a need within a market for businesses to position themselves by demonstrating that they meet that consumer expectation, and that has then the trickle down effect through supply chains back to fisheries to look at certification as a way to demonstrate in a credible and robust way that they're able to meet that need and therefore gain market access. And so, you know, that's going to be different in different markets according to the maturity of those issues. And then also the other function is the ecological readiness of fisheries to engage in that process. When the MSC was created, it wasn't that there weren't any sustainably well-managed fisheries. It was that they weren't able to differentiate and demonstrate that fact relative to the wider seafood sector or fishing industry sector. And so, you know, there are some fisheries that are able to progress quite quickly. Others had more inherent challenges, and you know, that's where things like ratings lists help provide a recommendation not only on you know, good performance, but also, you know, where some of those challenges remain. The interesting dynamic, you know, forward winding 20 years down into our history is, as new markets come online, they immediately benefit from a pipeline of 20 years of fisheries engaging in certification, and now having you know, over 14% of the world's fisheries engaged in certification, and then a number of others in assessment and moving towards certification. And they're able to accept, those markets are able to accelerate very quickly in demonstrating that they meet consumer expectation, which then creates a virtuous circle of strengthening the conditions for other fisheries to come on board. So it's very dynamic and regional specific, if that answers the question.
Thank you very much for your response. So Nisreen, I have a question for you in terms of regenerative agriculture. Please bear in mind that these questions are obviously coming in for some of the panelists specifically as well. So I have a question to do with what needs to change in financial modeling when investing in regenerative agriculture. What should investors be thinking about? And again, apologies if it's, you know, repeating some of the questions. These are the questions coming in from the audience.
No problem. That's a really good question. I'm also wondering if Tripp is on the call, but he would be much better equipped to answer this. So I would say, yeah, I think the importance of understanding patient capital and a return being, you know, something that is on nature's timeline. It may not be as immediate as other investments with seasonal variation, challenges with climate change and things like that, but regenerative agriculture is a resilient model in itself. So the hope is that it generates the kind of capital that is, you know, sustainable and resilient.
Thank you very much. And I will actually be going between the two panels, so apologies, but it seems to be a little bit disjointed. So as part of, you know, Source for Tomorrow, powered by CommonShare, we have actually, I mean, we really wanted to get this questions and answers networking session together for the food and beverage panels of this week. So we may be going between the two panels, but of course I would love to give as much opportunity for you to speak as well. I did actually have another question to do with, you know, the seafood side of things, which are there any best in class sustainable fisheries that could become a blueprint for the world?
Happy to have a go at that.
Please,
yeah.
So
we have our MSC standard has a range of performance indicators that fisheries are scored against, and these performance indicators have specific scoring guideposts for what would meet, you know, a 60 mark, a 70 mark, an 80 mark, and so on. The pass mark for certification is that the fishery is operating at averages of 80 or above, which doesn't you know, which obviously doesn't preclude it from scorings, you know, up to and including 100, which is, you know, world, you know, is that best in class sustainable fisheries. So all of those certification reports are listed online, and there are, you know, fisheries out there with very, very high performance indicator scores. So that gives an opportunity, you know, for the global community to have an understanding of against our standard what global best practice looks like, as well as looking by individual performance indicator around individual issues. So if there are specific scoring guideposts that are more relevant in certain circumstances, then there is that library example of what best practice looks like. I think the other important thing just to mention, if I may, is certification is not just about hitting that 80 average scoring point across the assessment. It's about driving improvement. And I think this is one of the really key areas where certification makes a difference on the water, is by encouraging what we call conditions, a requirement to improve scores over the term of the certificate. And this can be some of the most valuable insights and learnings, is how fisheries continuously improve once they've demonstrated they're fundamentally meeting a mark of sustainability. So that's all published on our website.
I'd love to add that since we have an agriculture expert on the phone, there's always a lot of excitement too around the use of the development of seaweed and shellfish farms. So as we look to how we're going to feed the world and how we're going to keep the oceans clean, we have a burgeoning population and our resources are not increasing. What can we do in those two fields? How can we make those two areas more accessible and more widely consumed? Because they address a lot of the issues that we have, at least on the aquaculture side of things, which isn't specific to the question, but it's one of the most interesting areas and maybe where our two talks sort of come together.
Thank you very much. And Herman, would you like to weigh in on that question as well?
Well, I think Toby and Ryan gave really good explanations, but to come back to their questions, are there best-in-class fisheries that could lead as an example? I think absolutely, and there is a number of examples, I think, that are also within the MSC certification program. I know, for example, the Alaskan pollock is, I think, almost scoring 100 out of 100 in the MSC certification. I think the interesting bit with fisheries is the diversity. So I think we have some really good examples of well-managed fisheries, very sustainably managed fisheries in some of the North Atlantic or the bigger industrial fisheries. But then you also have fisheries that are concerning many different species and in other areas, which come with different challenges. But all in all, I think there is, in most cases, we can find good examples, learn from that, and you see that also reflected ultimately in the standards and the science that is there. So yes, we can learn from good best practice examples, and there are good examples out there.
Thank you very much. And so I do have another question, which is to do, and I'm going to read it from the point of view of Alan Duval, who sent in this question. So he has said that one of the problems that he increasingly comes across in certification is that a great many micro businesses want to be certified, but simply can't afford it. For example, the annual cost for maintaining Soil Association accreditation is £750, which is 10% of the average SME's profits, let alone a micro business's profits. Does anyone have any comments on his observation?
I could speak a little bit to that, and I think maybe Ryan and Toby could add to that. But I think with certification, at least if you look at seafood, I think there's two different cases. If you have fisheries, they're often looking at larger scale operations, and then indeed the cost of an expensive certification, verification, assurance process can often be shared by the profits that product rises. The challenge of certifying individual smallholders, whether it's in fisheries or farms, is a real issue, and it's been a challenge in certification for a long time, and it results, and in aquaculture it's mainly in fishery, seafood it's mainly in aquaculture, as there's many individual farmers that are that according to the current model need to achieve certification. So one solution to that is if you can actually start certifying larger groups of farmers at the same time through groups and clusters, and there's different practices and programs out there that are trying to do that. And in that sense, I think fisheries is a really great example of that, because in many cases, actually, a fishery certifies many different operators that are operating within that fishery, and thereby the costs of that certification are shared by the collective profits, and are not coming down to having to audit and assess every single vessel in that fishery. So it's a real issue. I think the solution lies in finding ways where you can group and get collective certifications of larger groups that are operating in roughly the same conditions and requirements. And that could then spread the cost while at the same time remain that assurance. And there's models on the way for that.
Yeah, from MSC's point of view, and Herman touches on exactly the core issue. It's in certification terminology. It's around identifying a viable unit of assessment. So, I don't think we have many, if any, examples of an individual fishing boat, no matter how big that boat may be, choosing to get certified. It's always going to be a collective of vessels, and it's the age-old and probably unanswerable question of what is a fishery. And so, what we need to do is collate a group of operators that are acting on the same area in a similar way on like species to create a unit of assessment which is viable, both in terms of managing the assessment itself, but also then in terms of influencing the management of the fishery and the species that are related. And particularly looking in the developing world where there's a big focus on, immediately running to saying, what are the issues on small scale fisheries? It's more around how can we engage fisheries at a viable and sustainable level that can manage the certificate and seek the benefits over long term. And the same applies on land. We have models here in the UK for group assessments of independent operators. So, for example, there are, the national dish of fish and chips. We have 120 fish and chip shops, all operating under the same supply chain certification to be MSC certified, which again provides that economy of scale that enables operators of all scale, land or on sea, to be able to engage with the program. But it's not an unimportant issue. It's certainly something that we work very hard on. It's not as easy as I maybe just made it sound. So we have to continuously look at accessibility to all scale of partner.
And I'll very just quickly add that we don't, Seafood Watch doesn't, we do ratings, not certifications. And it's why I pointed on that first question to Toby, because certification is really their area of expertise. But it's absolutely something we're thinking about as well. Can you certify all the fisheries in the world? No, you can't. There's all sorts of logistical issues there. And so what are other tools that we can use? How can we improve the certifications, take them out more broadly, get them to more small operators, but simultaneously consider new and novel approaches that are going to help some of those other fishers and farmers get their product to markets that do care about sustainability.
Thank you all so much. So we actually have Tripp who has joined the question and answer networking session. So I'd like to just give him a minute to kind of introduce himself as well. So Tripp is the fund advisor for Flock. I could see him nodding along also to the answers which you were giving as part of the previous question. So please, Tripp, welcome.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. Brief introduction. I am managing partner of Trailhead Capital, which is a regenerative food and ag fund. And I'm also the fund manager for the Flock, which is a 501c3 nonprofit advocating for regenerative food, ag, and circular economy practices. And we've just partnered with Techstars for the first food and ag accelerator for a 30-company cohort starting in 2021. So passionate about all of these areas. And my background really comes from a finance background. I was alternative assets at AllianceBernstein. And then I bought an independent grocery chain after I left there called Alfalfa's in Boulder, which is an organic natural grocery chain. And, also run Colorado Wildlife Foundation for the last 15 years, and then sit on the Governor's Western States Water Partnership for the Western States water issues and conservation issues. Thanks for having me.
Thank you for joining us, Tripp. So I actually have a question directly for you. What was different about the model for How Good that made it exciting as an investment, especially given the failure of Good Guide?
Yeah, great. So one of our recent investments is in a company called How Good, which you may or may not be aware of. We co-invested with Danone in that venture. And How Good is a sustainability database. And they really started almost 14 years ago trying to differentiate on grocery shelves with grocery tags. And that really then pivoted and turned into a proprietary and sort of amalgamated database from a variety of sources. And if you're not familiar with it, you probably have seen the new Chipotle campaign where they're saying, we've sequestered X amount of pounds of carbon, we have conserved X amount of water, we're precluding X amount of antibiotics from going into the system. All of that's driven, those sustainability metrics are driven by How Good and their back engine, which is a brand differentiator, which we see as the next level, if you will, of product lifecycle assessments. So if you're familiar with B Corp, and Danone is the largest B Corp in the world, every product or SKU has to go through a lifecycle assessment, which talks about some of the impact metrics, but leaves off the table sort of the environmental metrics. And then what we are passionate about is also the social justice metrics. So one of the things that we're doing with How Good is we're putting together not only the sustainability metrics, so we can talk about sourcing from regenerative sources and grading your product or SKU based on, the sourcing and procurement side of it, but also, how does it stack up from a living wage, from a gender representation, from a BIPOC representation standpoint. And so that we really think that's adding, a really robust leg to the impact metric piece of the business, which again, I came from Alliance Bernstein where I helped with the ESG program in 09 and 10. And, that's a fairly wonky sort of academic audit-like procedure, which I think is lost from the consumer who's saying, I want a decision-making criteria for picking, the best stuff. And how do I get through all of that noise and understand something that's authentic? We think that's How Good.
Thank you very much. And actually, Tripp, I have another question for you directly. Again, apologies for picking on you as soon as you just joined. So transfer of land, if you were President Biden, what economic policy would you put in place, tax incentive or otherwise, for transitioning land to, as you say, mission-aligned holistic farmers?
Yeah, so this is, I think, an incredibly important point. And I think just to put a real sharp end on it, we have the largest land transfer in the history of the world that's going to take place in the next 10 to 15 years. Our average US domestic landowner is a white 76-year-old gentleman whose G2 isn't that excited about going into ranching or farming or taking over the operations, because in their lifetime, they've seen, their share of a dollar go from 50 cents to 15 cents, and yet their risk profile has changed none, if not increased. And so, there's an incredible opportunity to both engage and have inclusion in that land transfer. And so, what I'd like to see from a policy standpoint is, I'd like to see some homesteading or land subsidies to be able to bring the folks that have been underrepresented in food and ag back into food and ag. I'd like to have subsidies for education on, the methodologies like the Rodale Institute, the land to market that Savory's doing, some of these things that I think are holistic management practices that need, a subsidy or a tax credit from a federal standpoint to be able to get the flywheel really spinning. And then I think about, a company that we really like that we're about to invest in that is helping with that rotational grazing and understanding that, right now we subsidize barbed wire fencing to the tune of $20,000 per mile through federal dollars. We think there are better methodologies and ways of subsidizing the regenerative food and ag system by including some new thoughts into that space. So I'll stop there, but I think there's a lot of things that the Biden administration is doing and can do to really help leapfrog regenerative and the circular economy.
Thank you very much, Tripp. And now back to Toby, Ryan, and Herman. As humans, we are driven by money. So what financial tools out there that seek to protect and grow the habitat of fish life that humans do not want?
Yeah.
Sorry, what financial tools are out there? Apologies.
Yeah, I mean, it's a really, really good question, because what we're trying to do with our certification program is use the management of an economic asset around which there is a financial interest, the seafood that we want to extract for human consumption and for other uses, and apply a management regime that addresses not just that species, but also the wider marine habitat and the food chain upon which those species depend in terms of where it sits in the pyramid, in order that we, as an outcome, what we have is a holistically sustainable fisheries management across an ocean, within the ocean as a whole. So, it's not a financial tool necessarily, but it's using market forces to derive sustainable outcomes where otherwise there is a failure of the commons. The global public good of the ocean doesn't have a explicit financial price on it that would make it easy to otherwise manage sustainably. Where would that subsidy come from? So we're trying to internalize that cost and have a sustainable outcome.
And the question is, how do we protect the species that we don't value, correct?
So it was more about what financial tools are out there that seek to protect and grow the habitat of fish life that humans do not want.
They do not want, yeah.
Yes.
There are very few, and we're bad at that. We're bad at valuing the things that we can't eat immediately or turn into some sort of product. It is a failure of our current society. There are some very indirect tools. I will not put them out there and insult the audience by saying they're sufficient, because they certainly are not. But two tools that I can think of, one would be with the certification or rating, to Toby's point, is that if you are impacting other species that we as a conservation organization think are valuable, if in your bycatch you are catching birds, you are catching whales, whatever it may be, we are going to red rate you by our system, as an example. And so our partners will no longer buy that product, in which case there is a financial impact. Indirect, admittedly, we haven't assigned a value to that whale or that bird exactly, but it is one stick along that path. And the other side of it is that we've seen some success with our marine protected areas. And so the idea here is, if you set aside enough area, you have enough fish in that space, reproducing, going about their lives. Some of them we don't want, but some of them that we do, as those populations increase, we'll leave that space and fishermen will catch them. Now, the science around that is maybe not as solid as we'd love to say, and again, not a direct way to protect those species that we don't want to buy, but certainly trying to find a way to assign something to give them value is critical to not just our area of conservation, but I would say all.
Thank you very much. Herman, anything to add?
I think Ryan and Toby put it right. The only thing I can think about, and it's a little bit out of our scope of work, as we're more focused on the food or the fish that we eat, but an increasing value of eco tourism, and kind of starting to put a value on, like, how much does a whale actually deliver in terms of tourism and things that. So then it is still, I guess, a value for humans, and we use it in a way, but we're not consuming it in that way. So that's another kind of indirect financial mechanism. And I think there is some, recently you'll see some more evaluations of actually the monetary value. What's a shark worth in its lifetime for divers and resorts versus what's that shark worth if you kill it on fins. And those comparisons are actually interesting to see, and especially for instance, small island states that live off these marine resources. I think that might reevaluate the value they have in their environments and lead to certain protections rather than extraction and consumption if that's not done in a sustainable way.
Thank you very much. And I have a question coming in for Toby. What is the market premium for MSC certified seafood? As a retailer, what is the main benefit of merchandising MSC seafood? So some of these questions, again, they may be a little bit, repeating what's already been said, but if you'd like to go into more information, that would be fantastic. Thank you so much.
Yeah, sure. I think there's two dimensions to that. One is on the sort of the price of the raw material coming through. Fundamentally, what the MSC is seeking to do as a market-based program is use or to channel market forces in a positive direction by tapping into competitive pressure of companies wanting to demonstrate their sustainability. So, from that point of view, there can be premiums for certified raw material or cost of goods if there is more demand than there's available supply. So if we have an early mover advantage or a first mover advantage of a specific fishery or species that's of commercial interest or relevance, then that there can supply can attract a premium. Where that premium exists can shift, whether it's at primary catch level at the fishery level, or if it's in production. It depends on the necessary trade of that seafood and what the supply chain looks like. But then as the markets mature and more fisheries become certified, we tend to see that it transitions more towards a condition of market supply, where it's around market access. And if you're for example, rhetorically, the one fishery for a given species that isn't certified, you're at a competitive disadvantage. So that premium has been identified, and there's been some academic studies around that, but I wouldn't say it's universally applicable in all circumstances. And then in terms of the other side of what's the main benefit for a retailer to use the MSC label is coming back to that dimension that markets are driven by consumers, and we know from our consumer research that the general public value sustainability. They understand the connection to future generations, and they understand that their consumptive behavior has a direct relationship to that. And it's then about creating brand trust. So many companies will say, our customers trust us to do the right thing. Well, actually, I think it's subtly different, that your customers expect you to do the right thing. Certification is something that enables you to translate that expectation into trust by demonstrating in a robust and credible way that you've met that expectation level. And so then you're strengthening your brand proposition and increasing your brand value. And it's about the long-term investment in maintaining your market share and giving your customers a reason to come back to your store, tomorrow, the next month, and the next year.
Thank you very much, Toby. So I have another question come in, which is, how does this premium relate to ASC? Are B2B data sets between the two businesses shared? Do you collaborate with anyone or to aggregate the demand?
So there's an absolute wall between our data sets. So, it's obviously confidential market information. And so MSC and ASC market data is not shared. We don't have insights on that at all. What we do is collaborate at an operational level on things like our chain of custody standard is shared. An MSC certified certificate holder, chain of custody certificate holder, also is able to access ASC certified supply. We also align in the way in which our label use is administered. And so these are sort of common sense, pragmatic approaches to increasing accessibility. And then, of course, there's collaboration as values-based organizations in terms of looking at synergies with the way in which we engage with partners. And so, we would approach retailers in a sensible way in understanding their objectives, their drivers, and their needs. But important to say, not in an exclusive manner. There are other operators out there. Obviously, we have a close relationship with ASC, and what we're trying to do is meet the needs of partners that want an accessible and seamless relationship to be able to demonstrate sustainable and responsible supply to their customers.
Thank you very much. So now moving back to the Regenerative Agriculture panel, so Tripp, do standards or certifications, well-known standard certifications exist for regenerative agriculture? You're on mute, Tripp.
Sorry, great question. Yes. I would say that I think the regenerative movement is anchored in a couple of legacy certifications. One of them, which is a little less known in the US, but certainly globally, the biodynamic or Demeter certification holds a lot of weight. And so, I would say more in the EU, unfortunately, because of the sort of education that Demeter has done in the US. But that for me is sort of a legacy regenerative certification. I would say then, if you're familiar with the Rodale Institute, Rodale really came up with the organic standard and worked with the USDA in the 70s to make that ubiquitous. And so what they have done now, and Rodale is our chief scientific advisor for the fund, and we work really close with them. They have a new ROC certification, and that is the Regenerative Organic certification, which will take the fundaments of the organic certification and then go beyond that to think about husbandry and more than just what's the inputs into the field, the living wage, and all of the things surrounding the circular economy and regenerative as we think about it. So I think the Land to Market, the Savory Institute, if you're familiar with Savory and what Alan Savory has done, the Land to Market certification is also another one that is going to be sort of that beyond organic certification. So I think those for me are the two leading sort of think tanks or thought groups on the highest level of regenerative certification.
Thank you very much. And in general, is regenerative agriculture more expensive for farmers or less expensive or the same?
Yeah, another great question. I would say there's a debate here and it depends. But I think ideally, if I think about the circular economy and I think about, regenerative really means localizing and making sort of these redundant circular economies, right? And so what that means is, when you take out the middleman, and again, I'm on the retail side with alfalfas, and so I understand that, we can live on our 45% gross margins just fine. And one of the things that we do that's unique is you could show up today at my store and have your products on the shelf. So we have 6 entrepreneurs or local providers that come on a daily basis to the back of our grocery store buying operations, and we will put that stuff on the shelf, assuming it checks our boxes and we trust what you're doing. We will do it even on provisional organic products, right? So if we trust you, you're not quite to that certification level yet, but we know that you're intending to be there, we will bring those products in, label them accordingly, and allow you to offload those. So that's a way that you, as the producer, right, can have margin expansion by taking out the middleman. If you don't have to sell to a distributor who then takes $1 out of every $2, there's margin left there to take in 2 places. And so what we think regenerative should mean is that you take that margin expansion and you give it to the land steward, who I said earlier is fighting for a living wage with all the risk. We need to bolster and make sure that you have a living wage on that piece of the equation. We then need to be bringing food prices down so that we've got nutrient dense food access for everybody, not just the affluent. And so for me, the end all be all of regenerative ag is that we can begin to create a localized economy so that the local producers can bring their stuff to market. They get their full margin for doing just that. It allows that market pricing pressure to go down, and so that you can have locally fresh, nutrient dense food for everybody in the community. So I believe that regenerative should lead to lower prices eventually, once you can get, the sort of methodologies and those income streams proven out for that land steward.
Thank you very much. And how can we kind of get the word out about regenerative agriculture?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think, there's a groundswell of information and lobbying groups. I mean, my flock group is working hard to educate and amplify that message so people understand the value of these new methodologies and how beneficial they are, not only to the humans, which is very important, but the byproduct of this, right, is that we're going to be able to help the commons and the environment writ large. So not only through carbon cycling and water table cycling that happens through perennializing our grasslands, and doing the rotational grazing, through allowing, you know, the root systems to really grow and develop that mycorrhizal fungi, to what we've been doing from a tilling perspective to be able to sort of heal those practices. You know, we're trying to educate everybody about why that's beneficial. And I think, you know, one of the best ways is to start thinking and looking at, you know, movies and some of the documentaries coming out, like A Kiss the Ground, which I think is a really interesting. The Gatherer, which is another sort of one that's talking about the BIPOC community and how, you know, they're really underrepresented in food and ag. You know, I think some of those and panels like this help get the word out. And I think really at the end of the day, it's the ROI for the stewards and the cost reduction and access for the people that's going to drive the adoption of regenerative food and ag practices.
Thank you very much. And then a similar question for Toby, Ryan, and Herman. How can we get, you know, more information about the supply chain to do with seafood to the consumer? Sorry, Herman, for example.
So I think. So if you specifically talk to consumer, then probably Ryan and Toby are better off, as they're working directly with consumers, and we're more business to business. But I do think, just from my personal experience and looking at the programs that are out there, I think there's a number of developments that you see coming up, in particular sort of related to traceability. There's different initiatives and companies setting it up, and you see programs having QR codes on packages that bring you back directly to the farm. This is where that fish came from. This is where that farmer was based. You see in the Netherlands here in the supermarket, you've got a brand that's called Fish Tales, which is literally kind of referring to telling that story. And on all of the packages, you see the stories on that they're usually smaller scale operators that produce that farm, and on the packaging you see that story that's being told. Where is that fish being caught? Where is it coming from? And what I find interesting in some of the discussions I've had is we talk about regional food a lot, but seafood is global, and it will always remain global, because, you know, you can't catch every species that you want to consume in your backyard. So I think in seafood, the term that I heard come across, make global local, and that's exactly what you see on those packages. Like, it might be a farmer in Vietnam, but with the stories you see on those packages, it actually tells something where that seafood's coming from, and makes you feel that it's just around the corner, where it's actually on the other side of the world. So I think there's a number of those tools out there, but it's about creating that narrative, that story, and I think consumers are looking for that, and digital tools and innovations are helping to support that, whether it's a QR code that shows that traceability, or whether it's web pages where you can see it's coming from. And then I'm going to pass it on to Toby or Ryan to talk a little bit about the work that you do in that space.
Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, to Tripp's point, there's many different routes that are all mutually reinforcing. I don't think there's ever going to be one silver bullet. You know, we're always going to have a traditional physical environment of grocery retail consumption that means point of sale, and the advertising that goes on for those brands in you know, traditional channels such as billboards, TV, and so on, is always going to play a key role. But I think, you know, it's blending in how technology can support that, and not just technology for technology's sake, in terms of latching on to IT to create solutions that maybe have a short-term interest. I mean, you know, provenance is a really important piece, and it's the flip side of the same coin of traceability. We've seen, you know, a lot of investment, for example, into things like, you know, looking at your barcode and being able to see exactly which boat that came from, which is, you know, it's nice in providing that reassurance, but is that something that's going to create a long-term consumer trend to inform choice and purchase behavior, versus, you know, the disruption that we've seen in markets over the last 12 months around COVID and more home delivery is reinforcing, you know, trends that pre-existed. And so, you know, there is more consumption towards recipe boxes, meal kits, home delivery, online ordering, and it's a question of how sticky that is relative to the physical the physical traditional store environment. And so it's going to be a combination of all of those things, really, and also recognizing you're approaching different audiences, so that it's very fashionable to go with millennials and younger consumers that tend to or provide consumer responses to be more receptive to ethical consumption. But if we look at who buys and consumes fish, it's predominantly mothers of households with children that are buying on the basis of healthy food for their families. And so what are the communications channels that they're digesting information from? And so, what's the right channel for the right audience is also an important consideration.
I'd also add, on our messaging front, we've really come to the conclusion that consumers are tired. They walk into the store and we're only thinking about seafood, but they're going to buy 30 things and they've got to get home and they've got to pick up their kids. And so we more and more, both in our messaging and just our general approach, have been leaning on the alfalfas of the world to say, a consumer will trust you. They will go that far, right? They will say, this is the business that I trust or I expect or I demand, it is giving me sustainable products. And so MSC, ASC, ourselves, we can work behind the scenes with the businesses to do a couple of things. One, to ensure that 1,000 customers are going to come through the door, 100 are going to look at a logo, and 10 are going to have questions, right? And so for those 10 consumers who have a question, when they go up to the fishmonger at Alfalfa's or Whole Foods Market, they can turn and see, this is the MSC mark. This means this. This is why you can trust us. And the consumers usually go, great, thank you. Now I trust Whole Foods. Now I trust Alfalfa. And so working with companies at that level for consumer outreach to okay, give me your chefs. In the next couple hours here, I'm releasing a post about one of our company's chefs, just so that they can see. That's the kind of messaging that we're going to be focusing on. Yes, our brand is out there. Yes, we're an aquarium that most Americans know, so that puts us in a bit of a unicorn out there. But for most logos and labels, I think they're going to be working more and more with businesses. Trust this business, they buy from us, they have questions, send them to ASC, send them to MSC, and that's an easier way to get to busy consumers.
And I think maybe just one thing to build on that and make a comparison. I think this sustainability discussion, building on what Ryan said, consumers trust where they shop. So it should actually become a pre-competitive issue. And if you look at food safety as an example, all food you buy is actually having a food safety certification in place. It has that third-party verification, independent standards, but you don't see that on the pack. But it's there and you trust that. And I think taking a step further, if sustainability can become sort of a pre-competitive or non-competitive issue, and it's something that is a given and becomes ultimately part of what a product attribute like food safety. I think that's where we want to go, but that's a long way from that because there's still a lot of improvements that need to be made. But ultimately, that's where I think you need to be, that everything that you buy is meeting that sustainability mark. But that's the journey that we're on, and it's going to take a while before we're there.
Thank you so much. And then just as the final question from Alan, won't making a Vietnamese fishery feel like it's just around the corner be a problem for the CO2 associated with shipping, in that people will feel the emotional attachment and ignore the rational, and that will push demand?
Yeah, that's a really good question in terms of what's the climate impact of protein, and there's been some really interesting studies of comparing different production systems, which I'm sure many others can input to, particularly on the terrestrial side. And I think seafood often feels quite pleased with itself sometimes, that wild capture tends to have a much lower environmental footprint compared to other proteins, particularly terrestrial proteins, and that's true. But then in terms of the food miles, how far that's come, I think the method of transportation is by far the more important contributor than the distance over which it's traveled. That's not to infer any complacency. I think it's an issue that the industry is increasingly looking at, and I think that's in terms of how you transition to all sectors of society, improving the carbon intensity of the way in which food is caught, produced, and distributed. And so, I don't think the fact that seafood has a proportionally smaller footprint means necessarily that doesn't mean we should continue to look at the issue. But I think the other element is, if you want to drive change in a market, are you better engaging with people and looking at continuous improvement rather than saying that comes from a long way away, we should just ban it? Are you going to be able to take people with you with that kind of argument?
This is the most common question we get from consumers. We get it constantly, and it's a great question, and it's absolutely possible. But just to the answer that I give to maybe less specialized audience is always, it can be terrible, but if you're sending 1,000 tons of fish on a boat, the carbon footprint is going to be very, very small. If you're flying in salmon from across the world to a high end, then the footprint will never be sustainable. But the one part that I always try to get people to think about is, if you're using a pickup truck to bring a local fish from a boat directly to a farmer's market, that's a pretty huge carbon footprint as well. And so distance, just backing up what Toby said, it's how you get it there, not how far you brought it. But it's certainly something we should be considering more.
Yeah, and I guess I would just say, I agree, Toby, in total. We know, the terrestrial megafauna have an outsized carbon impact, and far outsized over all sea-bearing creatures. One of the interesting issues on that topic, though, is the megafauna in a rotational grazing and regenerative methodology have the ability to then sequester or help further the carbon and water cycles in a correct methodologies, right? So think along the old patterns with prey and predator relationships. That is a very carbon intense sink and recycle. And so the aquaculture part of that is less of an impact, but also has less the ability to help. And so I think that's an interesting conundrum that we find ourselves, because as we generally think about proteins, they are a major offender of the environmental issues that we find. And so, there's both habit changes that need to be made, as I see it, at large, to the way we think about proteins, sustainability, but also the way we deal with the proteins is a crucial feature to how much carbon they release or can help with that.
Well, we're coming to the end of the questions and answers and networking session. Is there any, last thoughts to do with the subject matter of your panels? For example, the future of seafood and the future of regenerative agriculture, which you'd like to sum up with? Toby, for example.
Yeah, sure, happy to. I think the key message from our side is that as an industry, we've achieved a reasonably good amount, certainly over the time that the issue has been live within the marketplace. Within our own program, as I mentioned, is about 14% certified and about 17% engaged in a process forward. So we have a good reference point on what good looks like, and we have a better understanding of the challenges. And we've also got emergent challenges. We've almost created an industry unto itself that then requires further and additional scrutiny. But then that also implies there's 83% to go. We've got a substantial challenge, and this is an issue that has been driven by Western markets, Europe, North America, increasing middle class emergence in Southeast Asia. But we need to look at a growing global population. We need to look at what the challenges of the world in not just 5, 10, 20 years, but out to 2050 and beyond. And so we've got to Herman's point about this becoming a pre-competitive issue. Perhaps by the age of my grandchildren, if we keep pushing in the same direction in a collaborative way. So I think it's where have we got to, but where have we got to go?
Maybe building from that, from your point, Toby, I think the collaborative part, and that comes back to the panel discussion that we had a few weeks ago. I think collaboration is going to be key. I think there's a lot of effort in the seafood sector that we brought into, and a lot of the first kind of years, decade were spent on drawing attention to the issue, actually realizing there is an issue. And I think especially in the last sort of 5 to 10 years, there's great progress being made in actually bringing together all actors that are involved and play a role. And to Ryan's point earlier, like starting to work more business to business, trying to bring together both producers, markets, governments, investors. And I think that's where the key is going to lie. If we can find collaborative actions, if we can find ways that in the end, where all actors understand that this is of common interest, and if we do it right, everyone will become better of it. I think that's what the focus of the future will need to be, and we've got great organizations, great examples out there how to work. So that also puts me in a positive mood, but as Toby said, it's going to take some time before we get there.
Thank you, Herman. And Ryan, anything to add?
Just that this conversation today has been really exciting because we have Tripp in the room, and that's to the point where we're going to have to collaborate. You know, we have to, sustainability of fish is one thing, but tackling climate change and protein's impact on it is a much bigger issue. And this is the kind of group we're going to need, right? And that's exciting. I think that's going to be really, really cool. So a bit of positivity there, right? If we can get the right people in the room, if we can talk about how our different industries interact and what we can learn from each other, I think there's a bit of light at the end of the tunnel.
Thank you. And Tripp, final thoughts.
Well, thank you, Ryan. That was kind of you. You know, for me, I think it's all about water. And so, you know, when I think about what regenerative ag is about, it's really a lot of talk about carbon sequestration, but the end result of why we want to increase the carbon sequestration is really because it allows porosity and allows the water cycle to increase, which if we can hold more water in the soils, then things can grow. We can create the system that we want and the photosynthetic energy recapture that we want. Where that relates to the oceans is that if we can't recycle that soil, that pedology and soil science can't hold that water, and we still, you know, apply the petrochemical additives, that water runs off, and it runs off into all of our waterways, the Mississippi River, the Gulf, all of the algae blooms, and then all of the quality of the water of which, you know, the oceans need is sacrificed. So it really is, for me, all connected, and water is kind of the, you know, the fundamental basis of all of it. And I guess just to add off, you asked me a policy question, and I felt like I was remiss in adding that, you know, we have a federal water system right now that is a use it or lose it system. And if I had one thing I would say to the Biden administration, it was, you know, let's be reasonable about allowing people to keep their consumptive use to what it should be for the crops they need, and not be penalized if they don't use the rest of their water allocation. I think that's a major disincentive in food, ag, aquaculture, everything we do, which could be solved by policy. And other than that, I would say collaboration is the key, and this has been a great panel. Thanks for having me.
Well, thank you all so much for being part of Source for Tomorrow, powered by CommonShare. These are the speakers of investment opportunities in regenerative agriculture, and also the panel on pricing and access, challenges and mass adoption in the seafood market. So thank you all so much for your time. It has been great.